It was 2 days later, in a grove of red hares on the border of the blue land. 7 whites were fighting moles. It was unheard of for whites to be attacked. They never carried weapons apart from the ones they were making for sale. This mole pack was large and led by a chieftain, more cunning and wily than most. What he wanted was more weapons. Whites looked like an easy prey. He was beginning to regret his decision. The whites didn't carry weapons, but they did carry tools. And a hammer is a weapon if you hit a head instead of a nail. They were standing around their big varnished boiler and fighting back, hammering back, and using varnished ladles as clubs and bits of burning hairs as crude spears. But they were outnumbered, and they were all going to die, and they knew it. There was someone watching who knew it too. Helena the Thunderorg watched from deep in the hares. It would be impossible to describe how a Thunderorg sees things. It would be like trying to explain the stars to a fish. But can it be said that she watched the fight a million times, all at the same instant, and every time the whites lost? It's the wrong description, but it will have to do. But among all the outcomes, there was just one, as alone as a pearl on a seashore of black sand. That was different. She turned without moving and concentrated on it. The hares erupted people. The moles turned to fight, but suddenly they were between 2 enemies. The Deafmeanies and the Mudrungs had found an unbeatable fighting method. The tall Mudrungs stood behind the small Deafmeanies and fought over the top of them. No enemy had much of a chance on 2 levels at once. It was a short fight and a terribly effective one. After a few minutes, the remaining moles ran for it. Some of the new attackers broke away to follow them, and then it was over. In its pearl on a seashore time, when someone whose whole life was a choice had been close enough to choose. Athen, the kilnmaster, leader of his band, looked up with horror as the white horse trotted through the lines of his rescuers. There was a small figure riding it. "How can this be? We were supposed to die," he said. "All of us." "Did you want to?" said Snibble, dismounting. Want? Want? That doesn't come into it," said Athen, throwing down his hammer. From out in the hares came the screech of a mole. "You changed things," said Athen, "and now terrible things will happen." "They don't have to," said Snibble calmly. "Nothing has to happen. You can let things happen, but that's not the same. We're going to where? There's Mudrungs and Deafmeanies and a few other refugees we picked up along the way. Why not come?" Athen looked shocked and angry. "Us? Whites? Fighting?" "You were fighting just now." "Yes, but we knew we would lose," said Athen. "How about fighting and hoping you'll win?" said Snibble. He turned as a Mudrung approached, carrying a white. "Argyrdan is dead, and one of the Deafmeanies," said the Mudrung, "and one of the whites, but this one's still alive. Just..." "That is Dirna," said Athen, "my daughter. She should be dead. In a way, she must be dead." "We have some medicine," said Snibble quietly. "Or we could bury her now if that's what you want." He looked at the Killmaster, who had gone white. "No," he said, almost in a whisper. "Good, because we wouldn't have done it anyway," said Snibble briskly. "And then you'll come with us. But I don't know what will happen next, said the White. I can't remember. You joined us and went to where? Said Sneebro. I can't remember what's going to happen. You joined us, Sneebro repeated. Relief flooded across Ethan's face. Suddenly he looked frantically happy, like a child who had been given a new toy. Did I? He asked. Why not? Said Sneebro. It must be better than being dead. But this is the wrong thinking. And, said Ethan, the future not, he hesitated, baffled. Not, perhaps, really, the future can be all different things? Pick your own, said Sneebro. But destiny, that's something you make up as you go along, said Sneebro. I've been finding that out. He looked up at a faint sound, faint enough not to be heard except by someone who was a hunter and whose life depended on noticing tiny noises. For a moment he thought he saw a pale figure in the shadow smiling at him. Then it vanished. Círdan was buried amongst the hares, with the death-meaning noble Parlan, son of Lenod, killed by a snarg, and the White who had died. The remaining Whites huddled among themselves, and Sneebro could hear them arguing. But he knew he'd won. They hadn't got any future anymore. They had to have one he'd given Ethan. They weren't used to making futures for themselves. They cast the last of the hot varnish into swords and spearheads, and piled them up so that the ragged army could help themselves. And when the army left, they went too, leaving their cart alone and cold. 1,000,000 times the White lost and were killed, but that was somewhere else, in a world that might have been. And now they were alive, and that's known as history, which is written only by the living. They went by narrow tracks that wound in and out of overgrown thickets. In some places, enormous hares had fallen over the path. Dust and fluff grew thickly, choking the spaces between the hares, so that the army could move only by hacking its way through the undergrowth that clawed and pricked them. Once in a path of thick orange hares, something hurtled out of the tangled bushes and buried itself in a hare bowl by Sneebro's head. It was a spear. Up in the hares, a shadow scampered, swinging to safety on a creeper, while Death-meaning arrows whined around like hydrometers. They never found out what it was, although it might have had something to do with the fact that a little later they found a city. It was not on any map of the carpet. For some time they had been walking through its overgrown streets, not realizing they were streets, until they found the statues. Little blue dust flowers grew on them, and fluff had planted itself around them. But they still stood in the center of their lost city. There had been 4 kings. Wooden crowns were on their wooden heads, and they each pointed with one arm to a different point of the compass. Ferns grew around their feet, and small creatures had made their homes in the crooks of arms and folds of the carven clothing. Around them, when you knew what you were looking for, in the way the hares grew and the dust mounds were banked, was the city. Age hung upon it like smoke. Thick hairs grew in the ruins of buildings. Dust had filled the streets. Creepers and tendrils had done their work, breaking down walls and venturing into hidden rooms. Insects chirped in broken archways. Hair pollen made the air sparkle. "Do you know this place?" asked Snibro. No one did. Even Athen had never heard of it. "Places can get lost," he said. "People leave. Hares grow up. Roads are overgrown." "By the look of those statues, they thought the place would last forever," said Snibro. "It didn't," said Athen flatly. "And now they've gone," thought Snibro, "or there's just a few left hunting around the remains of their city. No one knows who they are, or who they were, or what they did. No one even remembers their name. That mustn't happen to us." The whites weren't talkative now. It must be like being blind, Snibro thought. We're used to not knowing what's going to happen. A couple of hours later, they reached Dumi Roads. It was white, made of split hairs laid edge to edge. Every few hundred yards there was a hair carved with the image of a finger, with all the fingers pointing to where. They rode along it a little way. Here and there, the road had been broken when the carpet had moved, and they had to take to the hairs to get around the break. That's where they found the Legion, or what was left of it. Dumi soldiers were sitting or lying among the hairs by the side of the road. Some of them were asleep, others were wounded. Snibro had seen plenty of soldiers in Tragamaris, but they had simply been on guard. These looked battered, their uniforms ragged and often blood-stained. They hardly bothered to look up as Snibro rode by, but the ones who did caught sight of the Defmenes and started nudging their colleagues. One or two even reached for their swords. There was muttering from the Defmenes too. They moved closer together and eyed the Dumis suspiciously. Snibro turned in his saddle. "Don't make any trouble," he snapped. "Why not?" said a sullen voice from among the Defmeni ranks. "They're Dumi. You prefer them to be moles, would you?" He walked Roland over to the group of soldiers sitting on fallen hairs. "Where's your leader?" he said. The Dumi took him up and down. "Haven't got one," he said. "General got killed." There was a pause. "I expect you're wondering who we are," said Snibro. "Too tired to wonder," said the soldier, leaning back against the hair. "Stand up straight." For a moment, Snibro wondered who had said that. Then he realized it had been him. To Snibro's amazement, the soldier pulled himself upright. "Now take me to the highest-ranking officer." "I mustn't say please," he thought. "I mustn't give him a chance to think. He's used to orders. It's easier for him to obey orders than to think. That'd be Sergeant Karras, if he's still alive. Take me to him now." The soldier looked past Snibro at the ragged army, his forehead wrinkled. "I will talk to the sergeant," said Snibro. The soldier snapped back to attention. "Yes, sir, this way," he said. Snibro was led past groups of sullen soldiers to the heavy-set man who was sitting on the ground. One arm was in a sling, and his face was pale. He didn't seem to be bothered about who Snibro actually was. He was feeling low enough to accept anyone who seemed to know what they were doing. "Sergeant Karras, 15th Legion," he said. "Or what's left of it. We were called back here. Back to where? Urgently from Ultima Maris. But when we were on the road..." "There was a storm," said Snibro automatically. "Yeah, and then afterward..." "You were attacked by moles mounted on snargs," said Snibro. "Yes. Time and again, how did you know this?" "I'm good at guessing," said Snibro. "How many of you are there?" "About 300 able-bodied and a lot of wounded." I know a safe city where your wounded can be taken. It's only 2 days east march. If we spare some soldiers to escort them, we'll need too many, said the sergeant. There'll be moles everywhere. Not where we've been, said Sneebro quietly. Not anymore. And the rest of us will go with you to where? The sergeant looked down at the dust, thinking, I don't say we don't need everyone we can get, he said. Where's this paradise, then? Jeopard, said Sneebro. You must be mad. At the moment, there was a roar from the road. Both of them hurried back to where there was now a huge, pushing crowd of Doomy and Deaf Meanies, with the Mudrungs trying to keep them apart. Sneebro shoved his way through and found a Deaf Meanie and a soldier rolling over and over on the road, punching at each other. Sneebro watched them for a moment and then flung his spear to the ground. Stop that, he shouted. You're soldiers. You're not supposed to fight. Even the two combatants stopped to work that one out. I don't understand you, Sneebro shouted. His voice echoed off the hares. There's enemies all around us, and you just attack each other? Why? They're closer, said a voice from the Doomy ranks. He called me dirty, said the Deaf Meanie, who had been fighting. Well, you are, said Sneebro. So is he. We all are. Now get up. He stopped. All the Doomy were looking past him to Athen and the Whites. And Sneebro heard the whispering start. They've got Whites with them. Fighting. He glanced at Athen, who looked miserable. Sneebro sidled over to him. Don't let them know you can't remember this future, he said. They know the future, and they're on his side. Why should we fight for them if they treat us like that, said the Deaf Meanies. Sneebro spun around and picked up the astonished warrior by his collar. You're not fighting for them. You're fighting for yourself. The Deaf Meanie was shaken, but not afraid. We've always fought for ourselves, he said, and we were never counted. No, but the Empire was all around you, wasn't it? Keeping you safe. The Doomy kept the peace over half the carpet. All around you. Keeping and kept you safe. They never did. Think about it. There's Doomy towns all around you. When they defeated themselves, they were defending you. They fought for real so that you could fight them for fun. Sneebro was shaking with anger. There was a silence. He put the Deaf Meanie down. I'm going to where, he said. Anyone else wants to come? It's up to them. No one left, except for a small group who were going to accompany the wounded back to Jeopard. 2 of the Whites went with them. The Doomy felt a lot better with Whites around. They seemed to think that Whites only went where it was safe. That's what they do. The rest of them marched on down the road. Sneebro found that he was in command. The Mudrungs wanted to follow him. The Deaf Meanies were beginning to think that anyone who could lose his temper that badly was probably king. And the Doomy, well, the Doomy soldiers followed Sergeant Karras, and Sergeant Karras was riding alongside Sneebro. Most armies are in fact run by their sergeants. The officers are there just to give things a bit of tone and prevent warfare from becoming a mere lowercase brawl. The sergeant half turned in his saddle and looked back at the Deaf Meanies. Nice to have a cavalry at our side again, he said, even if they're still shorter than infantry. I fought against them a couple of times. Tough little people. That was under Banus. He respected them. He left them alone. He didn't like that back in where, but he always said, it's worth keeping a few enemies around, to practice on. I think he quite liked them, little odd chaps. Banus, said Snibble cautiously. Yes, whatever happened to him? Did he do something terrible? You know him? I've heard of him, said Snibble carefully. He killed someone, an assassin. The way I heard it, someone was trying to kill the young Emperor Targon during his coronation, hiding behind a pillar with a bow. Banus spotted him and threw his sword at him. Got him just in time. Killed him grit dead. Arrow missed Targon by inches. Funny thing is, Banus hated Targon. He was always in trouble. He said emperors shouldn't be hereditary, but elected, just like they used to be. A stickler for honesty was the general. Oh, there were always rows, but after that, he had to be, banished, of course. Why, of course? Asked Snibble. No one is allowed to draw a sword within 50 paces of the emperor, said the sergeant. But he saved his life. Yes, but you've got to have rules. Otherwise, where would we be? Said Sergeant Karras. But afterward, the emperor had the law changed, and they sent someone after the general. Did he ever find him? I don't think so. He was sent back tied to his horse with an apple in his mouth. I think the general was a bit upset. The Deathmeanies are mad, and the Doomy are sane, thought Snibble. And that's just the same as being mad, except that it's quieter. If only you could mix them together, you'd end up with normal people, just like me. We could do with him now, and that's a fact, said the sergeant. Yes, said Snibble. What do I do now? We'll have to camp tonight, I mean. I don't know what sort of orders you're supposed to give. The sergeant looked at him kindly. You say, make camp here, he said.